I believe we had a very productive meeting. There were many, many points that we agreed on, most of them, I would say, a couple of big ones that we haven't quite gotten there, but we've made some headway. So there's no deal until there's a deal.
No deal on a Ukraine ceasefire. But after nearly 3 hours of meeting, U.S. President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin claim they made progress. I'm Murray Brewster, sitting in for Catherine Cullen, and this week on the House, what really happened between Trump and Putin? A former U.S. ambassador is here to read the room. Then, my sit-down with the Chief of the Defense Staff on how Canada might contribute if a ceasefire in Ukraine is ever achieved. Plus, as Canadians boycott everything from American liquor to lettuce, should the government stop buying U.S. military equipment too? A former head of the Canadian Navy and a former NATO diplomat will be here to discuss. But first, a warm welcome and a red carpet for Vladimir Putin. Did the Russian leader triumph over Trump at the Alaska summit? The House is now in session.
We're going to stop really 5, 6, 7,000, thousands of people a week from being killed, and President Putin wants to see that as much as I do. So, again, Mr. President, I'd like to thank you very much, and we'll speak to you very soon and probably see you again very soon. Thank you very much, Vladimir.
Next time in Moscow.
Oh, that's an interesting one. I don't know. I'll get a little heat on that one, but I could see it possibly happening. Thank you very much, Vladimir.
It was an historic meeting with little apparent result. From the moment the Russian president arrived on American soil, a handshake, a pat on the arm, then Putin got into Trump's limo and drove off with a smile on his face. Ihor Michaelchishin is the executive director of the Ukrainian-Canadian Congress. I asked him for his reaction when he saw Trump greet Putin on the red carpet.
Pretty gross, pretty disturbing when you realize that this is Vladimir Putin, who is wanted by the International Criminal Court, who has overseen the murder and kidnapping of thousands of Ukrainian civilians, including children, and it just was a very disturbing image to see him welcomed so warmly by the American president. Red carpet, sharing a limo, handshake. I think this is a win for Putin. He gets on the cover of every newspaper around the world. Russia, which has been diplomatically isolated, is back. I did see a clip of the media yelling questions of him about, are you going to stop killing civilians? And he pretended not to hear. So I am glad to see that he will be grilled, on that by the media that's there. But it's really disturbing.
But what, if anything, was achieved during the summit? Michael Carpenter is the former U.S. ambassador and permanent representative to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. We spoke after the leaders' press conference ended on Friday night. Mr. Ambassador, thanks for making time for us.
My pleasure.
Read the room for us. Vladimir Putin spoke for twice as long as Donald Trump, perhaps almost 3 times longer than Donald Trump. What do you make of what the American president had to say?
Well, it was a pretty short press conference. There was no mention of the term ceasefire. There was obviously no agreement. I wasn't expecting there to be an agreement because, frankly, all along, I've been saying that the fundamentals don't align here, namely that Russia wants the subjugation of Ukraine and President Zelensky is not going to allow for the capitulation of his country. And in fact, there was no ceasefire agreement of any sort that was hammered out between the two leaders. What's interesting to me is that all along, I was closely watching Putin more than anyone else, because that was the most interesting variable to me. Would Putin come to this meeting with concessions that he could get credit for that would allow President Trump to sell some sort of normalization of bilateral relations with the U.S. Congress in return for a good faith, I say that in quotes, effort by Putin to resolve the conflict with Ukraine? Or would Putin come, as he has on so many previous occasions, with his maximalist demands for neutering Ukraine and for the cession of Ukrainian territories to Russia? It sounds to me from the press conference, although I can't say with great certainty because I wasn't in the room, but it sounds to me like it was the latter Putin, the maximalist Putin, who stuck by his demands. And there was really no way that President Trump could square that with what he's heard from European leaders and President Zelensky.
Well, President Trump said they agreed on several points, but there's a big sticking point. Speculate for me. What might all this be?
Well, agreed on several points. I mean, look, Putin said in the press conference that he wanted to find a way to guarantee Ukraine's security, which is just absurd on the face of it. This from a man who is bombing Ukraine with missiles and drones every day, targeting civilian facilities like hospitals and schools and kindergartens, resulting in civilian deaths and many wounded, many casualties each and every day, not to mention the fighting on the front lines, the torture, the rape, the filtration system of camps that Putin has set up across occupied southern and eastern Ukraine. So, the leaders say things that aren't always accurate. And when Putin says that he wants to somehow safeguard Ukraine's security, it's just patent nonsense on the face of it. And, I can see him saying things like that in the course of a meeting and President Trump nodding and then using that to try to tell the public that there were some points of unity between the two. But frankly, it doesn't sound like there was a lot that they could agree on here.
Putin said that he is hoping that Europe doesn't torpedo the agreement. What do you make of that?
Well, that's fairly predictable. The Russians have always wanted to have great power agreements over the heads of smaller countries. Putin has no respect for European powers. He very much wants to try to form a condominium with the United States, where Russia and the US as great powers decide on the fate, not just of Ukraine, but of, generally speaking, of smaller countries in their quote unquote spheres of influence. So, Putin was very enamored of Trump's idea that the US might, for example, take over Greenland, because that squares with his conception of spheres of influence politics. And so when Putin says he doesn't want the Europeans to torpedo the process, what he means is he doesn't want European leaders to tell President Trump to stick with principles, to impose costs on Russia, to not allow for the cession of Ukrainian territory to Russia and the undermining of the principles of the UN Charter. That's what he means.
Putin gave a great history lecture in his remarks, but also he referenced Trump's assertion that the Ukraine war wouldn't have happened had Trump been president. What do you make of that, and how do you think that's going to play in the United States?
Oh, that is the classic KGB officer in Putin speaking. He knows exactly how to press the buttons that will appeal to Trump. This is something that Trump says all the time. The war wouldn't have started if he had been president, which, by the way, elides the fact that Russia was attacking Ukraine throughout the course of President Trump's first term, when it was fighting in the Donbass, not the full-scale invasion that we see today, but nevertheless a low-boil war that resulted in many, many casualties and hundreds of attacks each and every day during that period. But, by saying this, Putin was essentially groveling a little bit before Trump, saying something that he knew would appeal to him. And indeed, I think I detected on President Trump's face a slight smile and appreciation for that comment.
If we take what they've said at face value and that there is the framework of a deal, mostly a deal there, what kind of maneuvering room does Ukraine have to say no to what's been agreed to?
Well, I don't take them at face value. I do not think that the contours of a deal are there. I think President Putin most likely proposed what he has said publicly in the past, which is that the 5 oblasts of southern and eastern Ukraine must be ceded to Russia: Crimea, Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, Kherson. Those are the 5. And then there must be a guarantee that Ukraine will not join NATO, that there will not be NATO troops inside Ukraine, which doesn't mean NATO qua NATO. It also means that countries like France or the UK should not have troops inside Ukraine. And then lastly, his demand is that there be a cap on the size of the Ukrainian military, that it not be allowed to rearm with the support of Western powers. Those have been his demands all along. He alluded to them in the press conference when he referred to the root causes of the conflict. Oftentimes, when Putin refers to the root causes of the conflict, he means Ukraine's rapprochement with the EU and NATO, and of course, its democratic, independent character. Those for him are unacceptable things, all of those.
So if there is no deal, what does the United States do next?
Well, I think President Trump is likely to try to play this out a little bit longer. I think he enjoys being center stage. It distracts from other stories at home, including the very pernicious story about the Epstein files. So I think he will try to see if it's possible to engineer some follow on meetings to this and see if maybe Putin changes some of the terms or maybe there can be more elicited from him in the future.
So was there a winner or loser out of everything we've seen?
Well, there's a clear winner, and that's President Putin. This is a man who was indicted by the International Criminal Court for war crimes. He was invited to U.S. soil, given literally the red carpet treatment, a press conference with President Trump, two leaders of great powers speaking before the world's media. It was everything that Putin wanted.
Ambassador Carpenter, thank you very much for your time today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Former U.S. Ambassador Michael Carpenter. Let's look at Canada's now strained relationship with the United States. Prime Minister Mark Carney has said Canada's decades-long security relationship with the United States is over. But with 75 cents of every defense dollar spent in the U.S., can we reduce our military dependency on our southern neighbor? Or will it make matters worse if we try to pull away? Wendy Gilmore is a former Assistant Secretary General for Defense Investment at NATO, and retired Vice Admiral Mark Norman is the former commander of the Canadian Navy and was also Vice Chief of the Defense Staff. Thank you both for joining me.
Pleasure to be here.
Thanks for having us, Mark.
Mark, how realistic from an operational point of view is it to pull away from the U.S.?
Well, yeah, I think it's harder than it seems. You know, the defense industrial connections, the economic connections are quite ingrained and entangled. And so it will be hard from an industrial perspective to do that, notwithstanding the desire to do so. And I think my other comment, not to broaden the conversation, would be that as we look to Europe, for example, and Asia to a lesser degree as potential substitutes, we have to be very careful that, A, we don't oversimplify what is a very complicated process and make it seem like it's easily achieved. And secondly, that we don't inadvertently substitute one dependency for another. So no, this is not going to be as easy as we would like it to be.
If I can just jump in, we have our relationship with the U.S. by design, dating back to deliberate decisions during the Second World War to integrate our defense industrial base. And now the situation is different. We have to think, frankly, not only where do we externalize our capabilities, who do we work with elsewhere, but frankly, what do we need to do ourselves? And I think one of the most exciting things that the government has announced, and let's hope they see it through, is this idea of a conscious defense industrial strategy in Canada and making conscious decisions about what do we want to have ourselves on shore with strategic autonomy and where do we want to go elsewhere.
Okay, well, what I'm hearing from the both of you is that it's not going to be very easy to disentangle ourselves from the U.S., but the Prime Minister and the political rhetoric has had this as the world has changed. The U.S. is no longer a reliable ally. So do we not have a duty to disentangle ourselves?
Absolutely. And I think the Prime Minister's language is entirely appropriate to the circumstance. You know, I don't think it's hollow and I don't think it's politically motivated. I think it's actually a genuine expression of concern and an expression of content. That the challenges, however, are not insignificant, as Wendy and I have both indicated. And there are both what I would characterize as technical challenges, not, and I don't mean that by like small detail. I mean mechanical problems associated with how this actually works. And there's also some other challenges with respect to capacity within the machinery of government. There are some ingrained biases within some of the military and material side of the military organization because, you know, it has been relatively easy for decades for us to maintain the dependencies that are now a vulnerability. It's not like we just walk away, return the keys to our car, and go to a different dealership. It's not that simple. And I know you're not implying it is, but anyway, that's my immediate reaction.
Well, I'd like to make a distinction, though, between working with the Americans and buying from the Americans. I mean, can we conceivably shop elsewhere for defense equipment? Wendy?
Working with the Americans means being able to be interoperable with them, which means that we have to be able to fit in seamlessly. They're so much bigger than we are. We need to be able to fit our capabilities and our doctrine, our tactics, techniques, procedures into their machine. Or we need to be able to be sure that we can operate autonomously. And as long as the Americans remain part of NATO, as long as we remain part of NATO, we have commitments to a whole suite of standards. And, it's not the most interesting thing in the world always, but standardization is one of the core elements of NATO, and it means that we can all work together. We can choose to go elsewhere for our equipment, but, it's a question of the first overriding imperative of our defense investment has to be what is best for the Canadian forces. And what's best could involve a whole bunch of things, not just the actual capability, but who we can work with the most easily, where we can source, what our supply chains are like. And those have to be conscious decisions. I mean, disentangling ourselves from the US on the military side is part of a much larger conversation about where does Canada fit in the North American economy and how much do we want to be able to operate independently?
Well, Mark, everyone else in the Canadian society right now is boycotting the U.S. I mean, look at what's going on in the grocery store. Why can't we do it from a defense perspective?
Well, we absolutely could. And I think the short-term challenges to doing so, not to oversimplify this, but would be one, there are a whole bunch of activities which are already underway, contracts in place, et cetera, which, to be honest, are easier left the way they are than going back and retroactively canceling things.
Well, my goodness, what contract are you talking about?
Well, no, hang on, hold that for a moment. And the second thing would be, I do believe that there is still some degree of sensitivity or concern because the administration in Washington is so unpredictable, and that there might be, an underlying, I'll call it trepidation. What kind of blowback reaction could there be? But before we drill into either, I want to come back to something that Wendy said. The whole disentanglement and the valid point you made, Murray, between separating our military capability to interoperate and our industrial dependencies, they are two different things. But what we've done is we've unintentionally, I'll be benevolent here, we've unintentionally combined the two, based on assumption, based on convenience, based on a whole bunch of things that have got us to the place that we're in. There are many countries out there that are incredibly important and reliable allies to the United States that have their own self-sufficient organic defense industrial capability. And they're no less useful or reliable as allies, even though they don't have the same degree of industrial dependence. So I think these are choices we make as we move forward. And I think we need to be very, very careful that we don't come up with arbitrary case studies to try and drive home a point that may or may not be helpful as we move forward.
Wendy, you wanted to say something?
Just many other countries have much more robust defense industrial bases that they control themselves, and they pay a hell of a lot more for them too. So we have chosen over the years to exercise whatever efficiencies we could by integrating our defense industrial capabilities into that of the states. Again, deliberate choices. Defense Production Sharing Agreement from the late 1950s and early 1960s. To disentangle that, we have to make choices about investment. And that means the government putting its money into Canadian industry and allowing those capabilities to be able to source for the Canadian forces.
Well, I wanted to come back to the point that Mark raised a moment ago about contracts that might be canceled. I mean, the Prime Minister has ordered a review of the purchase of the F-35s. I mean, 16 being delivered within the next year, but we've ordered 88 in total. The U.S. Ambassador, Pete Hoekstra, spoke to a Canadian podcaster, Jasmine Lane, this week about this subject, and let's have a listen to that.
You can't afford two different fighter jet programs. And it's like Canada should just decide what they want. Do they want F-35s? Do they want some other product? That's your decision to make, but you can't afford both of them. That's an irritant.
It's an irritant. But if we shop elsewhere for the remainder of our fighter jets, what are the chances we're going to be punished by the Trump administration? Wendy?
I think the Trump administration will decide if they wish to punish us or not based on whatever current thought of the moment is in the heads of the president and his key advisors. I think Canada needs to make the best decisions it can for our own interests. And if we're talking about the defense of North America, the F-35 is clearly the most capable aircraft that integrates with our plans for how it is we are going to cooperate with the U.S. in North America. That's not going to be a divorce. We remain in the same contiguous space. Whether we continue to the full fleet or not, there are real efficiencies. It's not for the U.S. to tell us where we can spend our money or not. That's for, again, the Canadian government to decide. But I would caution against leaping to the conclusion the decision on one program is going to impact the entire trading relationship.
Mark, very quickly, does the ambassador have a point? Can we afford two fleets?
Well, okay. Yes, he does. We can afford whatever we choose to afford. And this comes back to Wendy's repeated reference to making the decisions that we need to make that are in our national interest. What we need to be careful of is that we don't inadvertently, or perhaps for superficial political reasons, make what I would characterize as dumb decisions. And that would be to potentially impose significant cost on the institution going forward to carry two and completely separate logistical systems, in-service support systems, training systems, et cetera, et cetera. We could do that, and we've done it in the past, but we were a much larger force with much more flexibility in terms of how things were done. What I respect about the ongoing review is that we are being smart enough and mature enough to realize that these things are more than just buying a big shiny object, as I refer to them. And I like that, because I think it's forcing us to have some very grown-up conversations about who we are and what's important to us. What I don't like about these conversations is the concern, because we've seen it in the past, where we can make very short-term, politically motivated decisions that then have significant downstream impacts on the institution and how it's able to defend Canadians.
I've got one more quick question for both of you before we go. Canada, under Prime Minister Carney, is moving more towards a European orbit as opposed to the U.S. Will the U.S. just kind of let that happen unchallenged?
Again, I think I would disagree with the premise that it's moving toward Europe away from the U.S. I think we are diversifying our trade relationships, which is something we've been trying to do, back to the third option of the early 1970s. It is not a good idea for Canada to have all of our eggs in one basket, which is what's happened with our existing trading relationship with the U.S. We have to find more partners. We have to make sure that we're making deliberate decisions about what it is that is good for us.
Mark?
Yeah, and I would add that, I think that notwithstanding the current administration, which is hard to ignore, but I think we need to think beyond it. The United States has for decades basically said to us, if I can be somewhat blunt about it, we really don't care what you do or what you choose to buy, but would you please get on with it and stop talking about it? And would you please, step up as you need to do. So in this context, I think it's just an extension of that. I don't think they're particularly concerned about how we source our capabilities. I think they're basically telling us, would you please stop talking about it, get on with it, and build the kind of military that we expect you to have. And if their industrial base is less a part of that than it was before, I don't think it's going to be as big a concern as people think it is.
We are going to have to leave it there. Fascinating conversation. Mark, Wendy, thanks very much for your time.
Pleasure.
Thank you, Murray.
Retired Vice Admiral Mark Norman and former NATO Assistant Secretary General Wendy Gilmore. I'm Murray Brewster, and you're listening to a special edition of The House from CBC Radio, all about Canada's defence and security in a changing world. So how is Canada reacting to all of this change? In June, Prime Minister Mark Carney announced a big boost in military spending. He's set to rewrite Canada's defense policy only a year after the latest one was released. You're going to hear about that document, Our North Strong and Free, or ONSAF, as the military likes to call it, in my next conversation. The Chief of the Defense Staff, General Jenny Carignan, has been in her position for just over a year, and she joined me on Thursday in the House studio. General, welcome to the House.
Thank you, Murray. Thanks for having me.
You're in charge of the Canadian Armed Forces, but a lot of people may not realize that means you are the principal military advisor to the Prime Minister. With the world in turmoil outside of our borders, what have those conversations been like these days?
Well, providing advice is a dialogue, really. Yeah? So we need to understand that this is not just a one-way communication and then you're waiting for a decision. It is really a dialogue and exchange because those are all, as you mentioned, very, very complex situation, and many options can be considered, again, to support government objectives or, effects that they want to achieve.
Last year when you took on this job, you said that Canada had about 5 years to get ready for what may be coming. Is that still your assessment that we could be facing some kind of major conflict in the next 5 years?
So what I mean by that is we have to be in a position to deter. We cannot tell exactly what will happen in 4 years' time now, but the assessment is based on the major power competitions that we are currently observing, how they are evolving in technology, their current posture, and what we could potentially anticipate. So what is important for us, there's a clear realization that our geography is not protecting us as it used to before. So we have to be more proactive in assuming the defense of Canada in our own territory and our own sovereignty. So this is what this means in terms of preparation and observing the current dynamics. We have to be in a position where we can deter. So in fact, if you are successful at deterring, you're not going to have to fight.
Canada's major contribution towards deterrence has been the brigade in Latvia. Should Canada be doing more, and should Canada be acquiring strategic deterrence capabilities?
So we need more for our own territory, for Canada itself, especially when we are talking about the Arctic. So we need to invest more for our own defense within Canada, to see better, first, to sense potential threat, but also to be able to defeat them. So this is this combination. And once we have that, then we can use the same capabilities elsewhere. So definitely in Latvia, we are looking at various options on how to better perform there in terms of deterrence, but we are also heavily involved in the Indo-Pacific with Operation Neon, Operation Horizon, in a deterrence posture in that region of the world.
Canada has committed to being part of the coalition of the willing should there ever be a ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine. What does that contribution look like?
So we are, of course, I'm working with my Chief of Defense colleagues at the moment to figure out what the needs are. So the ceasefire, nobody knows what it looks like at the moment. Will we need a monitoring force? What will be the ceasefire agreements? So at the moment, we are looking at safe skies. We are looking at safe seas. We will need to design some type of measures to do that. What would be the involvement in terms of security guarantees? What will be accepted by the parties that are currently negotiating? So there's a lot of unknown at the moment. But one thing is for sure is that they will need a requirement for training and development for Ukrainian forces to assume their own security, which we are already there in terms of support for Ukraine. So this will continue, but the rest is currently under development.
But do we have the capacity for a sustained commitment to Ukraine?
It depends, again, what the demands are, where we could contribute, and it will be about, again, the government making this decision as to where they will want to contribute and how as well.
The federal government is pouring $9.3 billion into defense this year, with more promised in the following years. Some of that's going to go to salaries. The Canadian military has a strength goal of 71,500 troops, regular, and 30,000 reserve. That was established in 2017. You've been put on the public record as saying that goal can be reached by 2029, but really, General, is that acceptable in the current environment?
So this is the first tranche that we are aiming towards. So we need to aim towards going back to full capability. We will also onboard new capabilities in the next few years. So the work is ongoing to figure out the type of workforce, if I can express myself that way. So, for example, new platforms will require different skills. Like all Army, Navy, Air Force will need different types of personnel to crew these new capabilities. So the work is ongoing to identify how many and what is required. Some of them we already have an idea because those platforms exist elsewhere. So we already know that we need an additional 15,000 that have been identified, but we will be working in iteration to ensure that we grow those new capabilities over time.
On the F-35, Prime Minister Carney has put the purchase of the 88 new fighters up for review. We have had, over the years, and I've covered all of it, multiple watchdog reviews. We've had an open competition that went on for years. What more really could be studied? And what do you say to people who suggest that this is just nothing more than a bargaining chip to be used against the Trump administration?
I think this request came in with a new government coming into place. It's perfectly normal that with big projects like this, it involves a lot of money. There's a request to ensure that our processes are still valuable, that we are getting what we need. The context is also evolving worldwide. We are also looking at a different posture for Canada for our own defense as well. So it's a matter of ensuring that we are on the right track for the future of the Air Force.
When can we see that review?
I think we're expecting decisions at the end of the summertime, in early fall. So this is what we are expecting in terms of timing.
The Prime Minister's promised a rewrite of the defense policy, and that's in tandem with the defense industrial strategy. What needs to change from last year's defense policy?
I think it's giving it a little bit more precision based on evolving events. So we are still implementing a strong, secure, engage. We are still implementing, going ahead with UNSAF. It's ensuring, again, that we are on the right track for the current context and what we can anticipate in the future. To me, they are all coherent. It's just bringing in more precision as time goes forward.
More precision in what areas?
So different capabilities, new investments. So UNSAF was not necessarily designed with all of the capabilities we were looking for. But for example, there were a few capabilities as part of this policy that was in the explore category. Now we are getting more precision with new investments coming in. So submarines, long precision strikes, and so on and so forth. So as the work advances and we consolidate and we confirm this is what we need, then this can all be a part of the new updated version.
Finally, General, before I let you go, we've had renewed reports of extremist activity by some members of the Canadian military. Your own hateful conduct tracking system shows that reports were trending downwards up until 2024, and then there was a reversal. Now, I mean, some of that could be outside social and political influences, but specifically, like, what can you do to address hateful impulses coming from the outside of the Canadian military?
So first of all, there is absolutely no room for right-wing extremism as part of the Canadian Armed Forces members. So this is absolutely clear. CAF members know what the expectations are. And should they act trying to hide their behavior, it is only a question of time before we can find them. So absolutely no room for that type of behavior as part of our ranks. Now we have various processes that we have integrated as part of our arsenal of administration. So, for example, we have a probation period now, whereas we can release people quickly based on behavior. But also, we need to understand that we want to ensure that we have due process also at the same time. But it's about swift action, ensuring that we know we can shed light on what's happening, and then taking swift actions about it.
A lot of effort has been put into conduct and culture, a lot of it aimed at the sexual misconduct scandal that took place, but there were a number of policies that were put in place regarding hateful conduct. Is this a sign that those policies either need revision or that they have failed?
So we need to understand that we have to remain consistently vigilant about group dynamics and about how we are training people. So the reason why we built an organization specifically designed to do this, what I've learned over time is that if we think that we have solved the problem and then we can, move on to the next file, this is absolutely not the case. Humans are humans, and we want to make sure that we keep vigilance over their behavior and how people are basically working together as a group, as team members. So a lot of external factors, of course, influence people. We also notice amongst the Canadian population that reported police hateful crimes have risen consistently over time since 2009. And we want to make sure that we remain extremely vigilant about this within our own forces.
General, that's all the time we have. Thank you very much for coming in and talking to us.
Thank you, Murray. Thanks very much for having me.
General Jenny Carignan is the Chief of the Defense Staff. Troll factories, fake news, info-ops. The 21st century is an information battlefield, rife with propaganda, half-truths, and full-on lies. And the Canadian government is trying to make people more resilient in the face of it.
If it raises your eyebrow, it should raise questions. Check the facts before you share online. Learn more at canada.ca/disinformation.
Now a new book looks to ancient history to better understand the current threat. In The Information Animal, Canadian researcher Alicia Wanless argues that playing whack-a-mole with disinformation when and where it comes up isn't working. The Ottawa-based academic is with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. When I spoke with her earlier this week, I asked her to explain why she worries democratic governments are losing the fight against disinformation.
The thing for me is that we constantly focus on disinformation and what to do about it. And that leads us to kind of take a hammer and eradicate it as if it is something that can be eradicated. But it is something that is consistently always present, right? It's a byproduct of humanity. Really, what most people see it as being are beliefs that they're already holding, right? There's something that they don't agree with. It could be that vaccines are dangerous, or that they don't trust the government, or they think that it isn't functioning the way that it should. And the issue with that is that you're always on this back footing of having to deal with it, right? You're trying to refute it. It's already there. It's already present. And so it's like reaching into people's minds to try to change their perspective, which is going to just be inherently creepy and on the verge of censorship. In some cases, some authorities have tried to move ahead of that, getting out in front of it. So this was an example in the UK with the Liverpool car incident that had driven into a crowd. The police got out really quickly to say what ethnicity, age, and nationality the person was. That works if you have information, but it doesn't work in a time of crisis, like a pandemic or where we don't have information.
You've studied 3,000 years of human history. What do the ancient Greeks have to teach us about modern-day disinformation?
So in part, it's not just about disinformation. It's about some of the patterns that keep replaying themselves in information ecosystems. So when you look at a period like ancient Greece before the Peloponnesian War, you have two city-states, where one is Athens, and it's promoting a new idea around democracy, and that's in conflict with Sparta, who wants to keep the old existing order of oligarchy. But what's happened in this period leading up to it is that you've had a change in how people are communicating. Writing has come in. This is a big shift in terms of changing an oral society. So you have new means of producing information and sharing it. You have more and more people who are able to participate in it Information's moving faster with roads and the Navy, and this is leading to this information competition between the two city-states that ultimately ends up in conflict. And when I look at today, we have similar conditions across many information ecosystems.
So for the ancient Greeks, writing is sort of like what social media is to us today?
Yes, in a way, it really changed how people were producing content and sharing information. If you look at ancient Greece, it was something that Thucydides, the father of history, bemoaned. He complained that people readily accepted whatever first answer they came upon. It was also an issue in terms of making up answers for uncertain situations. When the Athenians were herded into the city behind walls, it was overcrowded, a plague broke out, a quarter of people died, and the Athenians needed an answer why. They blamed the Spartans. They said that it was polluting the wells. And at the same time, you don't really have the ability to control it, right? There was a great example of, in Mitylene, the debate about what to do about the revolt. It was obviously a public and open session because it was democracy in action. But somebody overheard it and was able to get to Mitylene in time to warn them to do something about it. So even trying to control information is not necessarily always possible. It's going to flow. It's going to move between borders. So what I think is that looking at the problem doesn't give us a way to deal with it. There are conditions and factors that are going to make it salient or something that people will accept. So we have to look around to understand what those conditions might be.
When we're talking about disinformation, and particularly on social media platforms, there's a lot of people who just kind of ask the question, why not just ban disinformation? Is that even possible?
I don't think it's really possible. Again, the problem with disinformation is in the definition of it, right? So if it is false or misleading content about a topic, first of all, you have to know what that topic is. So what are we going to do? Police all discussions about, for example, Ukraine or COVID vaccines? Allow nobody to say anything? Does that mean that somebody goes through and checks the writing of it or what's spoken in that video to ensure that it's complete fact? And then there's this whole issue of when it bleeds into opinion.
So what is the answer then? Because when you see so many false narratives out there, what is the answer?
I think the biggest answer, one, is to stop focusing on disinformation, right? You're not going to be able to eradicate it. It's a byproduct of humanity, and you're not going to be able to just police content. And if you are, you're falling into censorship. One thing is to look around. So are the people within that ecosystem, say Canada, equipped for even making sense of information? We've got some challenges, according to OECD data, about literacy levels among adults, numeracy level, problem solving, et cetera. Are we even having access to the right information that might be fitting our particular skills, right? Like, is news being produced in a way that people at a lower level of literacy can understand? Is it meeting their needs locally that they actually want to consume it? I mean, I think there's all of these ways in which we need to understand how people are actually being exposed and can access information. But then there's an added layer here. It doesn't matter how much awareness raising you do, how much fact checking you do. If people's lives are such that their needs aren't being met and they don't feel like they're being heard and they're not being engaged with different levels of governance, no matter what kind of awareness raising you do, they will still be susceptible to manipulation by domestic actors or foreign actors.
The other side of the equation here is that the amount of information out there is greater than it ever has been, I would say, at any point in human history. You talk in the book about our ability to be able to absorb that information. So is the human animal able to absorb all of the information that's coming our way these days?
There are open questions about our ability to consume all of the information that's coming at us all of the time. I think the thing about humans is that throughout history, every time a new tool has introduced a change in how we process information, it's also increased the volume and speed at which it has been disseminated and its reach. And we have consistently, as humans, found ways to deal with it. When paper was the problem in the early modern period in Europe, we started to devise ways of filing it, right? We created filing systems. We started to find processes to make it easier to deal with this influx. We created library systems, et cetera. And we're doing the same thing when it comes to modern technology. We are creating AI and things like this that would help us be able to cope with it. I think there are questions about how much we outsource our ability to sort through the information that's given us. I worry about our critical thinking skills to know that what's been put before us is actually correct. And so there may be questions here about how we need to foster not just media literacy, which is critical thinking about media, but just problem-solving skills, both at school levels and as adults.
Canada, like many Western governments, has invested in countering misinformation and disinformation, but yet it's still rife on the landscape. Is all of the effort and money for naught? Is it being wasted?
It's really hard to say. One, it's very difficult to get a handle on just the scale of spending. For example, since 2015, the EU has spent 50 million euros at least on countering disinformation. And that would be things like tracking disinformation, spending on media literacy, as well as fact-checking. The US probably was the bigger spender of it. In one contract alone, the Pentagon awarded nearly $1 billion to one company to counter misinformation. I would question how well that money has been spent given the current situation. But, a fraction of that could have gone into understanding the American information ecosystem to see how fractured it was and perhaps ill-prepared people were for the manipulation that does occur there.
What do you think Canada should do?
I think Canada needs to take a step back from trying to react to trying to, deal with disinformation directly, to look at the information ecosystem. We need to get a better understanding of who we are as a people. So looking at demographics, what languages are we speaking? Where are we? What kind of skill levels do we have? Also, what kind of grievances are tearing us apart? Because those are the fault lines that are most often exploited. But we also need to look at what kind of infrastructure and services we're relying on. I mean, right now we use a market share of Google and Microsoft is something like 90% in Canada. So all of our businesses, all of our government, we're using American technology. If there's suddenly an adversary, for example, this may be a problem. But we also need to look at communication services, cloud services, all of these things, but also the information that's available to us. We've got places where you have media deserts, right? People don't have local media. They may not be getting media in the language that they speak or at the skill level that they have. And so we have to reassess that. Beyond that, I think that democracies really need to start to be a little bit more imaginative. This isn't about winning hearts or minds or raising awareness. We may need to rethink spaces that bring different communities together. There are great examples in the Nordics. Oslo and Helsinki have reimagined libraries as these great shared spaces that offer services like 3D printers, and you can rent guitars and recording studios. And what it's done is that it's got all age groups coming to hang out all the time. They're full. You have a community. We also need to perhaps think about how to bridge divides between communities that no longer share a worldview. How do we mediate between that? How do we bring people who feel that they've been targeted or they're believing something that is disinformation that keeps them apart? How do we mediate between that? And I think we need to really do these assessments of the state of the Canadian information ecosystem as a system.
Alicia, thanks very much for your time.
Thank you, Murray.
Alicia Wanless is the author of The Information Animal. That's it for us this week. Next week, our summer specials continue as Pierre Poilievre runs in a by-election to try and win back a seat in the House of Commons. Kate McKenna will be in the host chair with a special focus on the Conservatives, asking, after 4 election losses in a row, what's the future for the party and its leader? Our crew on the House is Emma Godmere, Victoria Valito, and our senior producer is Jennifer Chevalier. I'm Murray Brewster. Thanks for listening.